Japan, Friday the 11th of March. The earthquake struck at 2:46 in the afternoon. Employees at this news agency started filming the first moments of the worst catastrophe to strike Japan in decades. Earthquakes are a common occurrence in Japan, but the magnitude 9 quake was the largest ever recorded in the country. This man says the quake was so strong he couldn't stay standing. This woman is 70 years old, and she says she had never experienced anything like it. I was frightened, she says. It felt like the whole world was shaking. The images of devastation are shocking. The city of Sendai in the northeast was close to the epicenter of the earthquake. Houses were destroyed. Streets simply ripped in half. But far worse was to come. The quake triggered a tsunami, a huge torrent of water racing towards the coast at hundreds of kilometers an hour. The wave grew taller as it approached land and smashed into the northeastern coast of Japan. A moving mass of mud and debris raced inland, destroying everything in its path. Those who were able to flee to safety watched helplessly as their homes were swept away. The tsunami struck suddenly, says this man. It took everything with it before it slowly drew back into the sea. And the crisis continued to deepen, especially in Fukushima Prefecture. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant shut down automatically after the quake, but the cooling systems used to keep the fuel rods from overheating failed, raising fears of a meltdown. The government declared an emergency, just as a precaution, it said. But inside the plant, engineers were working frantically to prevent a nuclear disaster. Survivors in areas hit by the quake and tsunami received little information on those dramatic events. Many were still waiting to be rescued. Here, a man was found clinging to scraps of wood, the remnants of his home. Those who survived by fleeing to higher ground were shocked at the extent of the destruction. Residents searched through the rubble for what remained of their possessions. No one thought the damage could be this bad, says this man. Japan has seen a lot of strong earthquakes, but never one this large. I've never known anything like it, he says. Entire towns were simply wiped from the map. Japanese Prime Minister Naoto Kan called it the worst crisis in the country since World War II and appealed to the nation to stick together. Hundreds of thousands of people were left homeless, forced to stay in emergency accommodation. Meanwhile, many were still waiting to hear from friends and family members, and the lists of those missing continued to grow. As the days passed, hopes of finding more survivors were fading. A nation in mourning, and a growing crisis at the Fukushima plant. There were explosions in the buildings housing 3 of the facility's reactors. A fire broke out in another unit. Radiation levels were rising, as were fears that a meltdown might already be underway. Nature had wreaked its damage with the earthquake and tsunami, but now a battle was underway against the awesome power of nuclear technology. Plant operator TEPCO was coming under increasing pressure to explain exactly what was going on at Fukushima. More and more people were evacuated from the area around the plant. But before they were allowed to enter emergency shelters, they had to be scanned for radiation exposure by workers in protective suits. Some were staying in shelters just 50 kilometers from the crippled Fukushima facility. Survivors watched as the crisis unfolded, but increasingly their patience was giving way to fear. They said it was safe, says this man. They said there was nothing to worry about, and I believed them. And this woman is angry that they weren't moved further away right at the start. The fears of radioactive contamination also reached the capital, Tokyo. The streets of the normally bustling city were uncharacteristically quiet. Many residents left to stay with friends and relatives in southern Japan. Those who stayed watched the news and used mobile phones to get weather reports, knowing that shifting winds could blow radioactive particles from Fukushima towards Tokyo. Despite their worries, most people were trying to remain calm. Further north, in areas hardest hit by the quake and tsunami, the search for survivors was continuing, but with little success. Meanwhile, shelters were struggling to provide food and water. There were freezing temperatures and aftershocks. Difficult conditions, particularly for elderly survivors. This man says there's no fuel left for the stoves. This woman says it's cold and everyone needs a hot meal. Meanwhile, the situation at the Fukushima plant was growing increasingly desperate. This footage shows the extent of the damage. Reactor number 3 was the main concern, as the only unit containing highly toxic plutonium fuel. Helicopters dumped tons of seawater onto the reactors. Lead plates on the bottoms of the aircraft were meant to protect the pilots from deadly radiation. From the ground, too, desperate efforts were underway to cool the reactors. Firefighters from Tokyo came to support the engineers. Authorities said they were volunteers. The task they're facing is dangerous and terrifying. It's a race against time. Some food products are showing higher than normal levels of radiation, and traces of radioactivity have now been found in Tokyo tap water. A new power line at the plant could be a major step in avoiding the worst-case scenario. That's the hope, at least, for many here in Japan. They're trying to stay positive. This man was reunited with his cousin 1 week after the earthquake and tsunami. A glimmer of hope amid dark days in Japan.